All right, I think we're going to go ahead and try to get started. I know we're running a good few minutes behind time. So I think for those of us who are tag members, please find your name tent, sign in, and have a seat at the table. I see we have a good, very engaged audience today, which is excellent. So I think I'll go ahead and kick off the meeting by doing introductions around the table. So my name is Jo K. Gosh, and I am the Health Effects Officer and Director of Community Air Programs at South Coast AQMD. We'll go here.
Dan Garcia, Planning and Rules Manager for AB 617.
Eric Praske, staff.
Paul Wright, Information Management.
Rafael Yanes, member of the community of Boyle Heights and East LA.
Jill Johnston, Assistant Professor at University of Southern California and member of the Wilmington Steering Committee.
Melissa London, Chief Scientist at AQMD.
Uduak-Joe Intuk, City of LA, on the West Long Beach, Carson, Wilmington.
Hector Garcia, Our Lady of Victory.
Hi, Tammy Yamasaki, San Bernardino Steering Committee and Southern California Edison Air Quality Specialist.
Marissa Blackshire, Commerce Steering Committee and BNSF Railway.
Good morning. I'm Sunny Ivy, Assistant Professor at UC Riverside, and I'm affiliated with San Bernardino Muscoy.
Good morning, Jason Lowe. I'm the Assistant Deputy for Monitoring and Analysis here at South Coast AQMD.
Good morning, this is Mark Carrera Sospedra. I'm an air quality specialist working in the air quality and emissions modeling group at AQMD.
Hi, Steve Zelinka, the Emission Inventory group at the California Air Resources Board.
Hi, I'm Parkpin, Program Supervisor with AQMD.
Andrea Polidori, Advanced Monitoring Technologies Manager.
Sengmi Lee, Program Supervisor in Air Quality Modeling and Emissions Inventory at AQMD.
I also want to mention that Janet Wittick sent us an email this morning. Her flight was delayed and she could not come here in person, but she is participating by webcast. So I want to welcome everyone to our second Technical Advisory Group meeting. As you can see, we have some kind of two basically meaty items on the agenda: the emissions inventory with a presentation from South Coast AQMD staff as well as CARB staff, and then discussion on the air monitoring plan. That's basically the agenda items 2, 3, and 4. So I wanted to open it up to the TAG members to see if there was. I'm sorry, I actually did forget one thing, a housekeeping announcement. So if you needed to use the restrooms, they're out this back exit door. Go through the little foyer to the left. In an emergency, we may need to shelter in place, duck and cover, hold onto your chairs, or evacuate the building. We have exits in the back and the exit in the front over here. Please silence your cell phones, and I think that's all, right? Okay, I think I hit all those points. Okay, so onto the agenda. So basically, there are two meaty topics: are emissions inventory and air monitoring. And my experience in the past is that either I can let the discussion go, in which case we basically get to one topic and it's whichever topic goes first, or I could be more firm and be a little bit more specific when it comes to time limits and being able to move on in terms of to be able to get to the next topic. So I'm going to open it up to the members and ask which you prefer. And if it's the first, where I can kind of let the discussion go on, then we would choose which one we would like to hear first, either air monitoring or emissions inventory. So, what is the pleasure of the group?
Combination of both.
Which one first? Yeah.
So which topic first, emissions inventory or monitoring? Uduak?
I would prefer the emissions first because that might inform the monitoring discussion.
Anyone else? Okay. Sound, Marissa?
I was just going to say I agree, and I think it would be ideal if we could get to everything. So.
Okay, so I hear try to get to everything, which means I'm going to be watching the clock, okay, and waving my hands. All right, okay, all right. Let's let's go ahead and go and proceed kind of as the agenda is shown here. So with that, we'll have Sang-mi take it away.
Good morning. My name is Sang-mi Lee, and I'm going to discuss emissions inventory, but this time more specifically the base year and then future milestone years, and for point and onward mobile sources. So when we had our first meeting in end of February, we discussed generally how emissions inventory were developed, the methodology, how each of the categories were developed, and how they were put together to represent the community level inventory. But then this time, the focus is more like what time frame we have to discuss, what time frame has to be included in the community air emission reduction program, SERP. So, and then for that, first also the types of pollutants, that's kind of the previous meetings we talked about mostly criteria pollutants and then air toxics associated with criteria pollutants. But this time we kind of more specifically classified that one group is definitely criteria pollutants we discussed last time. And then the other is air toxics compounds. And then having said that, also the time frame we needed to discuss today is what is the base year that the community emissions needs to reflect, and then what are, if there is a requirement, a statutory requirement to kind of develop the shape of the future emissions. If so, what years are we talking of? So kind of a little different focus than the previous meetings discussion. So I will kind of start with a recap of what we have and then what we discussed in the last time. So there's a question frequently coming up, what is the data vintage? What is the available data? What are the data we are relying on when we are talking about improving the air quality in specific community? So we have presented these topics multiple times, including last TAG meeting and the multiple CSC meetings. But then during all those presentations, the discussions were based on two sets of data. One is called MATES, so that's an acronym of Multiple Air Toxics Exposure Study. The latest, currently we have MATES 5 ongoing, but then prior to that, the latest available study is MATES 4. And the MATES 4 is based on 2012 emissions and meteorology and etc. And then what MATES 4 provides are the emissions of criteria pollutants, emissions of toxic compounds, and the contribution of such compounds to basin-wide cancer risk. And then the other set of data we relied on is 2016 AQMD data. This analysis was completed in 2017. And then that's also relying on 2012 emissions. But then now, since all the data we presented and discussed is 2012 data, and then now the question is this the best to represent SERP and then community inventory? And then with this statute and then also blueprint from ARB recently identified, they would recommend to use more recent year, that's 2017 as a base year. So the CARB clarified in these two guidance documents, community key elements and forecasting key elements. And that clarified that base year has to be 2017, and then future years, that's 5-year and 10-year from the adoption, from the selection of the community. So that means it's 2024 and 2025. So with this, we needed to talk about then how we can develop the emissions for future year. Needless to say, even the base year emission is challenging because of so many uncertainties and then so many different scales we are talking of. Then with that, then how does future year emissions look like and what is the methodology we can use to do that? So before we delve into details, I will start with a kind of general trend, what to expect. So this is NOx emission, the total NOx emission in South Coast Air Basin, and then total VOC emission in South Coast Air Basin. The years marked in the x-axis or kind of milestone years identified during the 2016 AQMD process. So, but again, this is to kind of give a general idea what we can expect. What you see in NOx emission goes down. It decreases with the time. That's mostly due to the regulations. So CARB regulation, South Coast AQMD has regulation, and some of the EPA regulations also contribute to this decrease. When it comes to VOC emissions, the reduction looks a little different. It is kind of leveling up in the future years, but that many different factors contribute to it. For example, population growth and then use of personal product, etc., also contributes to that. But anyway, the most of my presentation today kind of hinge on to NOx and then VOC. The reason for that is even if air toxic compounds are the primary concern of each community, these are the kind of surrogates or kind of the pollutants that to be used as a base to come up with the air toxic compounds. So VOC certainly has air toxic compounds, NOx in a sense less so. However, the methodology to use for NOx emissions forecasting would be very similar to air toxic compounds. Yes, go ahead, Udo.
Dr. Lee, for the 2019 data, do we have supporting measurements that that trend is accurate, or do we know if it's higher or lower?
So thank you for your question. So yes, certainly there are supporting measurement, but then again, the question is what level of details we are looking for when we need to evaluate the accuracy of emissions. One level of data, and then it's getting increasingly popular, is the satellite data. And then satellite data has been accumulated for decades, and then now real high resolution data that goes even less than 1 kilometer is available since last summer. When we are looking at those high level data, yes, they support the emission reduction trend we do have here. And then on different level, bottom-up level, there are surface monitoring stations. We also about 30 monitoring stations located within the basin. And then those, yes, also they confirm this trend as well. So hopefully this answered your question. So the another one, this one is the trend of NOx emissions from different vehicle categories. The reason I included here is, of course, again, the left side graph is NOx emission and right side is VOC. The reason I included this is the level of details exist in the emissions inventory. So it is not just on-road vehicle, but it has different category of passenger vehicle, light duty, medium, light heavy duty, medium heavy duty, heavy duty buses, and then we track or even develop the emission trend for all different categories of on-road mobile sources. Generally, the trends kind of change, kind of different depending on which category of vehicle you're looking at, because the regulations applying to it are different. So having said that, let me delve into actual methodology to develop the future inventory. So again, the point source methodology, similar to what we presented in the last tech meeting, is based on reported emission. We have annual emissions reporting program, AER program, that required all the major facilities located in the basin reporting to us every year. That includes both the criteria pollutants and then basic toxic air compounds, and approximately 2,000 facilities are there. And then future year, we needed to consider growth and then regulation factors. I will get into the details in the following slides. So these are 2017 emissions. Again, these emissions are reported emissions. The dots in the left side map view are location of all the point sources of which emissions are reported to us through our AER. And then the right-hand side, the pie charts, a relative contribution of different the sectors within the point source. For example, this specific community in the Boyle Heights and East LA West Commerce happen to have this is Wilmington community. So as we kind of expected, the fuel combustion associated with the petroleum refinery is the biggest contribution in point source categories. So next one, we repeated the same analysis for Boyle Heights and East Los Angeles and West Commerce. In this case, mineral processing and then food agriculture process are the biggest category within point source facility. And then third one is San Bernardino. And San Bernardino community has the food and agricultural process and service and commercial sectors that happen to be the largest contributor among the point source facilities. So the reason I started with this baseline inventory is that's the basically fundamentals or the anchor point to come up with the future emissions. So to project the future emissions, this simple equation explains the basic logic. So the first term, the written as BY is baseline emission. You establish baseline emission. And then two factors going into that are the control factors due to regulation and the growth. So economic growth and socioeconomic growth factors affect the total emissions as well. So next slides illustrate how these terms work. This is a kind of illustration. We took example of NOx emission as well. And then a little bit of explanation is required to this graph, I bet. So the first one is labeled as effects of selected rules that apply to NOx case, because this is example of NOx again. And then if you notice the y-axis is ratio, the rule factor ratio. So meaning that your baseline is 1. So let's say you are starting your baseline, and then it's the future years due to the regulations, newly adopted regulations, the emissions supposed to go down. So, for example, the first one, blue line, is biogas engine, the rules that applies to biogas engines. That's the South Coast AQMD's rule 1110.2. What that means is, so 2012, it is 1, so it is full inventory as it is. And then when it comes to 2019, the emissions has to be reduced almost 90%. So that's 90% reduction. That's also when rule is fully implemented, and afterwards it stays at that level. And another example, the red one, that's the coking operation for petroleum refinery. So again, that emission at time of 2019, the emission is reduced almost 50% to the baseline case. So regulation always brings emission down, unless you relax a regulation, which is really, really rare. So new regulations puts emission to decrease. Second factor, as described, it's a growth effect. So here, we expect economic growth, population growth. Because of that, the activity grows, the number of vehicles grows, and then the miles the vehicle travels, VMT grows. And then the growth activity also projected for different industrial sectors. For example, here is an example of growth in the sector of chemical manufacturing, or the growth in the primary metal manufacturing, etc. So with this combined, then you get the trend of emissions. And then the last graph, what it shows is the ratio of emissions with respect to the base year. Again, when we do this, we first do the basin total, and then we go down to each individual, the communities. So I will get back to the result a little later, but then this is a specific example of how growth factors are developed. So growth factors are primarily responsible for by SCAG, Southern California Association of Government. They, as a metropolitan planning organization, they have to come up with how fast and how quickly, how much this region will grow, and then how much our transportation will be needed to meet the demand. So that is the basic idea of regional transportation plan. And the 2016 one is they called RTP SCS, since they included sustainable community strategy as well. This table below is the example of the growth forecast developed during the 2016 RTP SCS. For example, population, what you see is 2012, in this South Coast Air Basin, has a 15.9 million population. In 20 years, in 2031, it will grow 12%, reaching to 17.9 million. To cope with the population growth, of course, there will be more housing units. As you can show, the 16% growth is expected over 20-year period. Of course, employment will grow, and then the VMT, the vehicle miles traveled, grow accordingly. So these are the growth factors. There are a lot more factors. This is just the example table that's to illustrate that these were used to come up with the future emission. And then another thing, we touch based on the regulation factor briefly, but then for the point source facilities, the primary regulations that apply to them are made by South Coast AQMD. And then these specific rules, we include the rules adopted by December of 2015, and then we are currently updating the rule factors as well. But then this is example for 2023. And then what it shows is, for example, the first one, Rule 1114, that the rule is about petroleum refinery coking operation. It shows VOC has to be reduced almost by 50%. Here, 0.52 means remaining portion of the emissions. So if your baseline emission, let's say it is 1, then due to this specific rule, by end of 2023, your emission will be remaining only 52% of your original emission. And then the rest are just the examples of it. And Rule 2005 is worth of mentioning here. So Rule 2005 is targeting the NOx emissions from refinery sources. Reclaimed sources. So reclaimed sources, we can say there's a larger the point sources within the basin that basically belongs to this specific sort of cap and trade of NOx emissions. And then this is actually huge emission source because those are larger facilities. And then this specific rule is targeting almost a 50% reduction of NOx emission by 2023. So when you incorporate all these growth factors and control factors together, you can see how individual emissions changes from year to year. So it would be easier to start from South Coast Air Basin total that is located, that's the fourth graph in your slides. So 2017 base year and 2024 and emission reduced substantially. These are NOx emission again. And then 2029 almost levels up and slight increase. That's due to the economic growth in the area. And then when you go to now, let's move to East LA, the very first graph, very similar to basin-wide trend, and then Wilmington also similar. However, this San Bernardino Muscoy community kind of stands out because emission looks like it is growing. What's happening here is majority of emission reductions in point source coming from reclaimed NOx reduction. So that was the 2005 rule 2005 in the previous slides. But then San Bernardino community happened to have less of these larger point sources. So emission reduction is not distinguishedly appeared here, but then the economic growth, population growth kind of overcoming that the regulation effect. So this looks like it is growing. However, I also like to make a point that the general contribution of point source in the San Bernardino Moscow community is relatively small. So we are talking about really fraction of attorneys differences from one sector to another sector. Now we're moving on to on-road source. So I will just go through a little bit fast because we already spent quite a bit of time here. So on-road, again, vehicle miles traveled or another travel activity data is coming from SCAG. And then emission factor, in other words, that's also control regulation factor as well. That's coming from MFAC. Future emission, the same structure. So travel activity forecast coming from SCAG, and then regulation factor coming from MFAC model. That's the emission factor model. And this is one example showing how we come up with the community level emissions, especially for on-road mobile sources. So on-road mobile sources, we do have this the travel activity defined in very detailed level. What shows in the left side is the VMT per so-called traffic link. This is kind of a segment of rows that the kind of minimum unit that SCAG uses to forecast or to forecast travel activity, or in other words, allocate the travel activity. The right-hand side is actually travel analysis zone. What that means is this is where the vehicles are located, where travel starts and stops. In other words, where vehicle stays overnight, so evaporative emissions from the vehicle can be assigned to or calculated from. With that, this is 2017 result as well. So this shows 3 different communities. First one, Wilmington. Second one, East LA. Third one, San Bernardino. And then it depicts 5 different categories. Light and medium duty, those are mostly passenger cars. And then heavy duty category. When it comes to heavy duty, we typically split them into 3 categories: light heavy, medium heavy, and heavy heavy. So what indicates it in this graph is Wilmington community, the biggest contribution coming from heavy duty trucks. Those are the largest truck, the big rigs you see on the street. And then it's intuitively kind of matching to our understanding, right? Because there are lots of goods movement happened in this community. When it comes to San Bernardino, and then when it comes to East LA, you can see the pie representing light and medium duty. This is basically passenger vehicle increased compared to other communities. That's also agreeable, knowing that East LA include major traffic freeways, the traffic corridors, including major freeways and interchanges. So contribution of light heavy duty becomes larger in East LA. San Bernardino, it kind of representing the San Bernardino profile is kind of in between the 2. With this baseline information, we're going to future emission again, very similar. So travel activities coming from SCAG, and then regulation impacts coming from MFAC model. So MFAC model, it provides you emission rate and then a number of vehicles or number of vehicle miles traveled and the model year, and then model year information. That and then basically a fleet turnover. All of them are basically incorporated in this emission factor model. So this is example of how these 2 factors incorporate to come up with the future models, very similar to point sources. So I will kind of sweep through this. So first one is emission factor. Similar to rule factors, emission factor goes down in the future year, meaning that vehicles become cleaner in the future year due to the regulations. And then second one shows the growth factor. So because of the growth in population, growth in economic activities, the number of vehicles and the miles that vehicle travels expected to grow. However, at a certain point, what you see, it might change, but then that's depending on geographical location. So second graph, the red one, and then the blue one, it shows the vehicle mile traveled goes down. On the contrary, San Bernardino, still VMT expected to grow further. What this indicates is it is expected that kind of the population growth is faster in the inland communities, and also there could be some shifting of the demographic factors. More people probably migrate out to the inland counties due to the many different reasons, more economic growth over there, and then living expenses, consideration of living expenses, etc. So that's why the growth profiles are different depending on geographical location. And then when these two combined together, still good news is even if there is a growth in the inland counties, the total emissions go down due to the regulation. So the next graph is the again, the NOx emissions, and then 3 different communities and the basin total, the changes of emissions from base year to 2 milestone year to future milestone years. First one, for the left side is a light and medium duty vehicle, meaning the passenger vehicles, and right side is heavy duty vehicles. Passenger vehicles, emission goes down. But the heavy-duty vehicles, somewhat in 2029, emission is expected to grow. However, currently, the rulemaking at the California Resources Board is currently addressing these concerns to bring the emissions further down. So these are brief, the presentation about how the projection to the future years are made for point and on-road mobile sources. I'm almost up for the time-wise, but I will go through very quickly what the air toxic compounds we are considering here. So air toxic compounds, again, point source, there are reported reported emissions. But the on-road, area source, on-road and off-road, they has to come from somewhere else. Typically, those are criteria pollutants. Specifically, VOC and PM are used to estimate tax. So point source wise, we have a specific program called AB 2588, which is another word, toxic hotspot program that requires the facilities to collect emission data of TAC, toxic air compounds, and then have them report their emissions to us. And if they are above a certain threshold, they are required to provide even more data and then even do health risk assessment, and if it's necessary, even mitigation of it. So these are very complex program, but then lucky for us is this provides TAC emissions reported to us every year through our annual, through AER software interface. So these are air toxic emissions only for base year 2017. The first graph, the left one pie chart is point source contribution, and then second one is on-road contribution. And the tables on the right, it's provided the actual numbers. But then one thing I need to emphasize here is these numbers are actually toxicity or the risk-weighted emission. So when it comes to toxic emission, there are, first of all, hundreds of species, and then many of them has barely kind of few pounds per year emission. However, as you know, these are air toxics with reason. So because they have a the risk associated with it. So the fair comparison of air toxics, or not even comparison, fair way of estimating air toxic emissions is to consider risk factor associated with the individual compound. And then here, the way we did is diesel PM, we considered that as 1. And then others, everything else is scaled with respect to it. So one example is, for example, when DPM risk, if we say that's 1, then hexavalent chromium is 1,000 times more risk than DPM. So even if the amount of emission, for example, the hexavalent chromium is 10 to the minus 4 of DPM amount, when you consider risk factor, it came out as the largest contributor. and the numbers in the table reflect that. So having said that, I will skip through this toxic the result with members and the public, and then if you have any question, we'll get back to there later. And then also we are working on projecting this air toxic emissions to future milestone years. So having this summary on the screen, I will conclude my presentation.
We do have a question from Janet Wittick, so I'll read the question. It says, how were industrial growth factors determined, or were only the 4 categories shown in the slide used? So this is the slide showing the SCAG growth factors.
So Janet, thanks for your question. So the answer is industrial growth factors actually all part of SCAG's growth forecast. The 4 categories included in the slide is just an example and did not include any of industrial growth factor. So when SCAG come up with the future growth planning, they needed to know each individual sector, how much they will grow, because each individual sector has a different growth rate. And then that is basically shifting of different industrial demographics. So the answer is yes, they are available. And then if you are interested, I can send you the link to you as well. Thank you.
So Janet, I saw you also had a question about the impact of area sources. So I think that leads us into the CARB's presentation. So CARB's presentation covers off-road, mobile, and area sources. So the short answer is yes, they will be included in the inventory. And as far as being able to show point, area, mobile, and mobile source contributions together to see the relative contributions, at this point we're kind of doing a bit of a divide and conquer between South Coast and CARB. So you can see, yes, the data is a little bit split up, but we will be combining them, in the final analysis.
I have a question.
Okay, Sunny.
Short question. Thank you for your presentation. In the NOx on-road emissions projections, what is the 2024 dip in relationship to? Is this?
So you are referring to slide?
It doesn't have slide numbers.
Oh, it doesn't have slides. So then can you?
I'm sorry.
Can you repeat your question?
It's projecting future on-road emissions. Example of NOx. It's there's a dip, but I didn't see the regulation that it was associated with.
Are you talking about this slides? So your question is dip in 2024 in the emission factors or in the total emissions?
For impact 2017, the first plot.
So why the slope is changing? Is that the question?
Right. Is there a regulation associated with that?
Oh, yes, always there is a regulation. So what this means is possibly a regulation starting from 2017 going onward could have been fully implemented at that point. So it does not bring emission reduction effect anymore. But this is typically not just one regulation. So again, kind of example-wise, there are 4 specific regulations that have been incorporated in this plot even since the adoption of MFAC 2017. But then each of these regulation has a different implementation schedule, and then as the combination of implementation schedule, the slope changes. And then at a certain point in the future, when all the regulations are fully implemented, you can see more the effect of economic growth. But then we also have our ARB expert here, the impact inventory, so we can have further discussions later on.
I think since the 2 presentations, the South Coast presentation on emissions inventory and the CARB presentation are related, I think we'll go ahead and take Raphael's question, and then we'll go ahead with the next presentation. Oh, you have a question? Okay. She doesn't have a card. Got it. Jill's question, excuse me. So do you also have a question? Yeah. Okay. All right. Raphael, then Jill, and then CARB presentation. Go ahead.
Okay.
Got it. Thank you. So Going back to we might as well just start from the on-road mobile emission trends in the South Coast Air Quality Management District slide. It's a few back.
The very first one, you mean? This one?
Yes. Yes. So, looking at the trends and whatnot, I know we have a good amount of data, a good amount of practical data that the model can actually be validated for light and passenger cars, because we have the smog program, and that smog emission data and stuff. We can really hone in on and validate the model. The question is, and I'm hoping the future regulation, if CARB is there, I'm pointing at you, CARB, to go ahead and implement a diesel truck smog program in order to help validate this data, not only to validate, but also to help enforcement of existing regulations, because we have the regulation and laws in place through the Clean Air Act and various other regulations adopted by not only the South Coast Air Quality Management District, but also CARB here in California. We need to make sure that because of the trends in the way goods are moved and movement towards shipping everything online, and the way goods and services are provided now, it's going to be more and more. We're going to see the increases in diesel truck traffic and all other stuff. We need to make sure that many of the goods, because they're independent contractors that are moving these and providing the goods and movements and services, we need to make sure that the equipment that they're using is in compliance with existing regulations. And right now, we don't feel that there are, and there's not enough checks and balances in order to make sure that that's happening. So that's why the model is showing, the trend lines the way they are. I think if we have actual testing, periodic testing, as does many of the automobiles that are on the roads today, we'll see that line have drastic changes, and this model will actually change and show that the base, and I'm sorry I'm getting feedback. So many of the models will change drastically for diesel emissions. And that's one of the things that we need to really take a hard look at, because I know our community in the Boyle Heights Commerce area is greatly impacted by mobile source emissions, and there's just not enough really good data. And that's why we're hoping for the monitoring that's going to be occurring in the communities will show this. Another thing that on the next slide, the methodology for point source emission testing. For point sources. So some of the questions and whatnot that I had was, verifying that the companies haven't changed processes, because we know that because of efficiencies and whatnot over the years, companies have changed their process, tweaked their process, so to speak, and their permits don't reflect that. So their end product could be the same, which in their eyes doesn't really change their permits and permit requirements, but their process does. And so, during the course of their process, they may have fugitive emissions and whatnot that they're generating now, but that's not caught, because in the AER program, after a certain number of years, if their trend is below a certain baseline, they drop off. So they don't have to necessarily report anymore. And so I think that process needs to be reevaluated. I think because of improvements in technologies, improvements in processes and whatnot, and various tweaks and changes and stuff that many of the companies do, every 5 years, I think they should be required to do another source test and then report based upon that. So that's something that the district can do. I know it's a lot of work, but it's something that's definitely necessary because of the changes in very drastic way that technology and industry has progressed. And so we can't rely on decades old permits that are existing to just continue to ride on. I just want to make sure I've covered it all.
So thank you for the question, Rafael.
Yeah.
So the first DPM, yes, we all are aware of the significance of DPM emissions, and ARB actually working very diligently to reduce DPM emissions. There are the new regulations that's not even reflected in the graph here. So if we projecting DPM emissions to future years, actually it will be like a dramatic decrease, we can see. So that's a part of the toxic emission projecting for future years. We will discuss that. Plan to discuss that next working group
DPM?
meeting.
What's the acronym?
Diesel PM, sorry. Diesel particulate PM, so meaning the PM emissions coming out of diesel vehicles.
Yeah.
And then talking about the smoke check and then enforcement, that's a INM program. Inspection and maintenance program, that's also part of the CARB's regulation, but then how to enforce and then what's the compliance rate, those things, yeah, we are all kind of have conscious about it, how to reflect that correctly in the inventory and then how to improve it eventually. And the second AR part, the emission part. So thanks for your comments and then for the insight how these facilities operate. So, but then on our the practice-wise, if a facility emits more than a threshold, which is 4 tons per year, all of them are required to stay in AER program, and that's required to report to us. So unless they go below the threshold, they are not supposedly drop off from the program. But again, actually the emission, reported emission versus if there is any emission escaped from the report, that's also enforcement issue that needed to be addressed under this program.
So there's just 2 more points that I need to touch on. So when talking about growth factors and whatnot, we need to make sure and again partner with what the some of the plans that Caltrans and whatnot is planning. So we have the expansion of the 5 freeway that's coming up that's literally coming up the freeway. So within the next 10 years, we're going to have like literally the
that should be in the RTP. That kind of a major freeway expansion is the main purpose of coming up with this plan. So we are attracting enough federal highway fundings to do the project.
But some of the projects don't have current federal funding, so it may not fall in the radar, and so that's one of the concerns. But we know that there's talk of it, and it's actually designed and actually on the shelf already, and ready to go. So we just need to make sure that it is incorporated and not just it should be, but we need verification that it has been incorporated into it, and then the other.
Yeah, we can provide this growth and then regulation separately for your community, so we can verify the growth is properly reflected.
And then reflecting, of course, the goods and services movements, because that trend, that switch from literally going to a store and all that other stuff in going to this new model that's happened literally in just a span of like 3 years. Now the majority of goods and services are actually being shipped to the home and that kind of stuff. So that puts more trucks and whatnot on the. So I'm not sure that trend has been really captured because we've been operating on this data that's from 2012 for a number of years, and no one ever saw this coming. And then the other thing is the toxic hotspots that you were talking about. In my experience with the toxic hotspots, it seems very random on how the hotspots is chosen, and it just doesn't make sense. When I finally think, oh, okay, I can make heads or tails out of it, it throws me for a loop. And there's really no rhyme and reason, it seems, for this program and how facility is actually chosen. Because for instance, I had one facility that's, let's say, on this location, and the distance to a sensitive receptor is no different from another facility, but yet it's not reported. It's not in the toxic hotspot. So really, what I would think that would trigger that, where maybe perhaps one facility that's higher emitting, that's not in the toxic hotspot, and yet another that's not.
So I have to get back to that question with more details with the step in the hotspot program. But again, what we start with is 24 species of so-called basic tags. That's reported not only facilities under AB 2588, but all the facilities within AER has to provide it. That's our starting point, or our kind of first step of screening is, so kind of gives us some defense that we are, in a certain degree, we include all the toxics in this risk assessment. But then having said that, yes, we will get back to you what's the criteria of the choosing this facility subject to AB 2580.
I just
we can
think
discuss.
that I just think that there needs to be a reevaluation after a certain time period of those facilities, just to make sure that staff and the permitting staff is keeping a trend, or keeping that program abreast. Because again, rhyme or reason to it. I know people have a lot of reporting issues and stuff, and I know staff has consulted and hired out consultants in order to help report. And then there's been a shift in the type of reporting that was previously done. I think it was a reevaluation of the program, I think in 2015, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to the change in the statewide guidance. So it wasn't a change in reporting, it was a change in how the risks were calculated. So we're happy to provide that data. The 2588 program actually has, and it does an annual report. So that's probably a good resource to answer some of these questions. So I'm going to move on to Jill's question, and then we have a question by email as well.
So I just have a brief request for, as you come up with these final emissions inventories, especially for the toxic air compounds, that we could also see the amount of pounds released within the area, as well as the number of facilities that are releasing it. I think that would help us think through that, particularly the air monitoring side.
Sure, we'll do it. So, but then the facilities, we are only talking about point sources, right? So when we do air toxics, we will continue doing it for on-road and off-road and then area sources. But yeah, yes, we will provide the pounds per day or pounds per year scale as well. Thanks.
So there's a question from Julia May from CBE asking if we could provide similar graphs for PM, particularly PM 2.5, PM 10, and total PM. So similar graphs to NOx and VOCs.
So thanks for your question, Julia. And then answer is yes, we do have a similar graph for PM, but I'd like to make a quick comment that in South Coast Air Basin, directly emitted PM is only small percentage of entire ambient PM concentration. So, but the more than that's why when we are talking about PM, it would be more considered as a toxic due to the diesel PM, and then that will be part of the toxic compounds discussion scheduled for next TAC meeting. And then, yes.
Okay, Steve, go.
Okay, is there a clicker to proceed?
Yep.
Okay.
Pass it down. There you go.
Okay, again, I am Steve Zelinka. I am from the Emission Inventory group at CARB, and today I'll be talking about area sources and off-road mobile sources. This first slide is really just a high-level view of the four components of the inventory. We had stationary area, on-road, and off-road. And the point here is just to show that kind of who is taking the lead and who is presenting today on these topics. In reality, I want to emphasize that this is a very collaborative process, as inventory development always has been with CARB and the South Coast District. So a little background on how we develop community inventories. One of the first things is, how do we characterize the sources that are important to that particular community? So one of the things that we use would be spatial surrogates on a grid. And this allows us to look at what are the biggest sources that might impact a particular community to make it more community specific. We use the regional emissions to allocate to these grids. And these were developed through a recent 2016 SIP and Air Quality Management Plan, which was a collaborative effort between CARB and South Coast. During this effort, we looked at methodologies, base year emissions, as well as forecasting assumptions such as growth and control profiles. We'll then use those profiles to apply to these community inventories. So first, we will come up with a consistent 2017 base year. By nature, area sources and off-road sources, they tend to have data from a lot of different years. They get compiled, they get modeled. So there's not usually a single year. They tend to be grown. In this case, we'll make sure everything is grown to a consistent 2017 base year to start with. And then we will apply the regional level forecast scalars to these. And these are broken down, by county, air basin, and district, try to represent the sources and the equipment types within that particular region. So we will also be using TOG and PM to speciate in order to obtain the toxic species. And Sang-Mi mentioned speciation a bit earlier, so I won't go into that too much. Also, diesel particulate matter is something we'll also derive from the inventory based off of sources with diesel combustion. Okay, so the next is, this slide is really meant to illustrate kind of the relative scale of the community inventories. I'm plotting PM225 for year 2017, but I really don't want to get into the actual emission values of the grid cells here. The point here is to illustrate kind of the relative scale of what we're doing, what we can obtain using spatial surrogates, which are taking these regional level estimates and applying them to known locations from spatial surrogates of certain parameters that are associated with a category. So here we have the three communities. We have Wilmington, West Long Beach, Carson, San Bernardino, Muscoy in the middle, and then East LA, Boyle Heights as a third. So this really allows us to better characterize the emissions and the categories that are important to those particular communities. And then also within the communities, some of the more resolved areas of emissions. Okay, so next we're getting into forecasting of emissions. So once we have a base year inventory, we can then forecast it to future years by applying the growth and control assumptions. These are based off of growth surrogates, and they are using various industrial surrogates like fuel consumption, maybe human population, housing units. We get these data from various agencies and industry, Department of Finance, sometimes econometric models. We also then want to apply any kind of controls. So this can be in the form of a regulation or an emission reduction program, but it also gets into advanced technology penetration and new equipment, new model years. So you saw this equation earlier. I won't go into it in too much detail, but it's the same equation that Sang-Mi showed, where in order to calculate a future year emission value, you have the base year, you have a control factor, and a growth factor. While this equation looks fairly simple. Really, all of the work and the details kind of go into compiling these factors. So I don't want to understate the amount of work that goes into, developing a control profile and also assigning growth surrogates. In the case of mobile sources, it's even more complicated, I think, than just assigning a growth and control profile. These tend to be modeled, and they want to take advantage of fleet turnover and the fact that, as equipment ages and gets replaced, you have a new emission factor. So there's somewhat of a lot of moving parts in these models, and it's sometimes difficult to extract purely a growth control. But they do try to account for everything from the latest data available from testing and the latest technology. This is a high-level plot similar to what you saw before of just basin level NOx, TOG, PM2.5, and then diesel PM. So we'll drill down into these categories a little bit more, kind of the way we did here with diesel PM, where we have some of the more off-road equipment broken out by trains and ocean-going vessels. And these are the trends for the key years that we mentioned, 2017 being the base year, 2024 and 2029. So jumping into off-road, we have mainly two types of off-road sources. We have those that are located maybe at a facility that has an established operation. So we have forklifts, cargo handling equipment. And we also have the non-facility sources that might be a little bit more dispersed, maybe move around a bit throughout a region, such as construction equipment or ag equipment. So in these cases, we have varying levels of the type of data that we can obtain for them. We might have a better sense of hours of operation and the equipment that are registered in certain locations from, say, facility specific. In the other case, we might be looking more towards, spatial surrogates and using other data sources to show where might this activity be occurring. But there are reporting programs, both mandatory and voluntary. There's industry surveys, and that's how we try to obtain, what is the population and age of the equipment that's being used and modeled in these inventories. This slide goes just into a little more depth from the last slide, and it kind of shows what are some of these known locations where we have off-road mobile equipment and emissions. So we have ports, rail yards, rail lines, and we have a good sense of the equipment and the hours of operation. In other cases, we have, for the example of satellite or agricultural data, we might have satellite data that shows crop types and harvesting operations, industrial facilities and construction, looking at land development. Also, in the case of, say, a transport refrigeration unit or a TRU, we might be looking at distribution centers or grocery stores and also the roadways around those areas. Okay, so in the case of specific categories in the off-road inventory, the off-road inventory is always under continuous development and improvements. We try to get the latest available data, latest assumptions on growth. So one example would be trains. We recently had updates as part of the 2016 SIP and Air Quality Management Plan. Some of these would have been population updates, activity and age distribution provided by the major rail companies, UP and BNSF. We had rail activity and fuel usage forecast from California Board of Equalization. And we updated the locomotive survival rates and tier distributions. We'll also be revisiting that again this year. Here is a basin level trend of emissions from trains, and you can see the reduction of both NOx and diesel PM. I mentioned that when we are using forecasts for a particular community, we'll actually drill down to the best available trend for that particular region. So in the case of San Bernardino, we would be using San Bernardino portion of South Coast Air Basin, and that's going to reflect the known equipment that's registered in that area. In the case of the other two communities, we could use the LA South Coast type trend. When you look at them visually, they're very similar. So I'm just showing the basin trend here, which kind of represents them fairly well. I didn't want to overwhelm us with plots, but this gives the general idea. Another thing to note is that all of the off-road emissions are reflective of all regs that are currently adopted by the board in our baseline inventory. Okay, so ocean-going vessels, or OGV, is another category that underwent recent updates. We now have specific detailed activity on each vessel visit, which is available now as required under the at-berth air toxic control measure. Growth projections were updated using forecasts specific to the SAM-BEIJ reports and also checked against the freight analysis framework for consistency. Other vessel-specific assumptions were updated, including the trend of larger ships and recent widespread adoption of slower speeds. And it also reflects the delayed introduction of the Tier 3 engines to the period of 2020 to 2024, or 2040. So here is the trend for ocean-going vessels, OGV, in the South Coast Air Basin, and it's pretty representative of what would be used for the ports of LA and Wilmington. That's going to sort of drive this trend, is that's the community with the emissions. So you'll really only see the OGV emissions directly in that Wilmington, West Long Beach, Carson inventory. Looking at the trend, you'll see there are some reductions in emissions based off of regulations from post-2012, but we also see that general increase as we see the expected growth in the economy and in shipping. As Raphael mentioned, we do want to look at shipping and how this relates to other categories and be consistent amongst all of those categories. Other port-related sources could be commercial hovercraft and cargo handling equipment. Commercial hovercraft is another category that will just be in the Wilmington, West Long Beach, Carson community as it has the port. This has also had recent updates for turnover rate methodology, and we'll also be revisiting these assumptions again this year. It also reflects cargo handling equipment control measures that are on the books. It uses activity that is actually directly reported to CARB and reported to the ports. And it uses growth assumptions that are consistent with the ocean-going vessel model. So here is a basin-level trend of both commercial hovercraft on the left and cargo handling equipment on the right. And you can see there are reductions that we can see from various regulations and through just fleet turnover, natural turnover. Other off-road equipment would be in the form of transportation refrigeration units, or TRUs, construction equipment, and industrial equipment. And these are some of the categories that might be more dispersed throughout the region, and we'll see showing up in really all of the communities. The first TRUs is reported to CARB as part of the Arbor reporting program, and the other two equipment types are also reported to CARB as part of the in-use off-road diesel fleet rule. So we are always trying to update these known inventories and populations of equipment. Here are some trends for those categories. So we have TRUs, and we have construction equipment on the right. So notice with the TRUs, we saw a drastic reduction in diesel particulate matter into future years. Similarly, we have reductions in construction equipment as well. So we will apply these trends. These are basin trends, and if you look on the left, you're seeing actual tons per year. But the important thing here is that we will be using the curve. We could have normalized these to 1, and we will be using the trend that is specific as possible to that community. Next, I'll touch on area sources. There are 2 types of area sources. There are those that operate over large areas. They're kind of dispersed over large areas, such as consumer products, paved road dust, architectural coatings. There are also area sources that they're really smaller point sources that get sort of estimated, maybe more of a top-down approach. They're estimated in aggregate over a particular region. So even though they are these stationary aggregate sources, and for that matter, the area sources are estimated at this higher level, regional level, we still break them down through the use of spatial surrogates, as I mentioned earlier, to try to determine where would they be, where the emissions would be. So something like consumer products might be associated with areas of population. Wood stoves would be areas where there are fireplaces. So this is a trend of PM2.5 from area sources at the basin level. Area sources have a wide, diverse range of source types, so it really makes sense to kind of break these down into the individual categories. So we'll do that next. Two of the categories, as we've been looking at the 3 communities in South Coast that show high PM2.5 or significant PM2.5, is residential wood combustion and commercial cooking. So looking first at residential wood combustion, this is going to be associated with really wood fireplaces, wood stoves, particularly if it's PM2.5 emissions. So our control profile that goes into the base year inventory is going to use, our growth profile uses some of the district assumptions that we used for the SIP, which is a no growth assumption. And there's a district rule for 4 or 5 that is also being accounted for. So I'm showing this more as an example of how a growth profile and a control profile go together to make a forecast. These are rules that are incorporated in the baseline inventory right now already. I'm not saying that these are future reductions that will be part of any sort of plan. The spatial surrogate is also listed here. In this case, we have a spatial layer of fireplaces, which we use from 2017 parcel data, and we also have residential wood heating from the American Community Survey. The next category would be commercial cooking. This would be from restaurants with char broiling activity. So we have sources of data which have been obtained from the district, from the California Restaurant Association. We have a growth surrogate of total employment from SCAG. And again, there is a district rule that historically has addressed commercial cooking, and I just wanted to mention that as something that goes into our forecast parameter. And we use a spatial surrogate, char broiling, which is from the Dun & Bradstreet Market Insight, which is a business directory, to allocate that to specific locations. Next, I'll get into TOG for area sources. And again, this is the basin level TOG profile. TOG is total organic gases, similar to ROG or VOC, which are the reactive components. What's important about TOG is it's going to represent something that we could speciate into individual species, individual compounds, many of which would be toxics. We can do similar things with PM as well. Now, some categories when we're looking at TOG are going to include methane, so that's why it's important to kind of look at specific categories and understand, which would be the ones that are most relevant to certain toxics. Since today I'm focusing more on the forecasting methodology and trends, I will keep it at the TOG level so you can see sort of the shape of that curve. But do keep in mind that when we develop the community inventories, we will be speciating into the individual compounds, which would follow a similar trend. So the first example of a category that was shown to be significant in the communities for TOG was consumer products, and these would be your personal care products as well as spray paint. They tend to be associated with areas of human population, so we use human population as the growth surrogate, and we get that information from the Department of Finance. We also have several regulations on the books at CARB for controlling consumer products. And in terms of a spatial surrogate to allocate to the communities, we would use population and housing units. And we recently had updates in these spatial surrogates from a UC Davis contract. Another category that seemed significant in the communities was degreasing. These would be chemicals used for manufacturing. It's kind of a broad category of all types of degreasing and solvents. This is grown through manufacturing output surrogate from SCAG. And historically, there have also been several district rules which have addressed this category, which are essentially baked into the baseline assumption. As a spatial surrogate, we can use our industrial layer to kind of allocate this to areas of known industry within the communities. Again, this is developed by a recent contract with UC Davis. Okay, so next steps, we want to complete and finalize our detailed base year 2017 inventories for the communities, and that would include criteria and toxics. We'll then apply our region-specific forecast scalars, and these are by category to each of these emission categories. We'll be leveraging the recent work that was done by both CARB and the South Coast Air Quality Management District for the 2016 SIP and Air Quality Management Plan. And we'll then provide and present complete and forecasted area and off-road inventories to fold into the overall inventory. So with that, we can take questions, and I do have one that came in through email. So this is a question about when will the inventories be ready? This is a question that we get all the time, right? Anytime we're developing an inventory. So this will be a joint effort with the district, and we are working consistently to try to get inventories done. And I don't know if you have a better timeline, Sang-Mi, but you can address that.
So, Steve, we will be providing this area and off-road per community level as well, right? And then the timeline-wise, we will be finalizing year one communities emissions inventory before next tech meeting. So next tech meeting is tentatively scheduled early to mid-July, and then that is the stage to finalize emissions inventory. And then we'll make sure we have all the data ready and available to the members and the public prior to the meeting. More question over there, Maria?
So I just have a couple questions. My first one is on slide 4. I just want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. Dark green is the best, red is the worst, or vice versa?
I'm assuming red is the worst, but yeah, again, I just wanted to reiterate, we were trying to get something on here to show the resolution and trying to be somewhat non-specific. We are going to present detailed inventories by category and in time. I just wanted to show what data resolution we were working with.
Okay. And then on slide 8, you've listed locomotives as facility sources. I guess I would sort of challenge that idea. There's very few locomotives that reside in yards or specific yards,
So I think what we mean by facility, we're not necessarily talking about a point source, but we're saying if there's a known area of operation, like a rail yard or maybe at a port, where we have a good idea of the number of locomotives and how often they stay there and how long they idle, we're saying that we have estimates for those sources at a facility-specific area, as opposed to just looking for a spatial surrogate to kind of allocate to.
And then I guess my last question is on the TRU data. Significant drop in DPM, but an increase in NOx. Can you explain what that's attributable to?
And that's would be the result of, you might see this also even in a heavy-duty vehicle, where if you have something that's directly trying to control particulate emissions, like a trap or a filter, you might see that the PM drops, but then the NOx is going to increase with the level of activity. So perhaps usage is increasing in hours of operation, so that's why you're seeing the combustion and the NOx increasing, but you are then capturing and controlling the particulates.
Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. I'm not sure if this is within the scope of your inventory, but where are aircraft emissions and off-road cargo handling equipment? Where is that in the inventory?
Well, that's a good question. Cargo handling equipment would be in this off-road inventory, and there it was
for airports specifically?
So so there is some ground support equipment that would be within the off-road inventory, and that is under off-road equipment. It's not in the terms of these communities. There's not a lot of emissions for them, so that's why I didn't. You're not seeing them presented, but they are in the off-road inventory. Now, airports and aircraft is a category that traditionally is not necessarily lumped in the off-road inventory. And it's something that the district would take care of.
Thank you, Steve. I will just follow up very quickly. Aircraft inventory, yes, we develop aircraft inventory based on actual aircraft activities reported to us by individual commercial airports. However, as Steve mentioned, it's not haven't been discussed extensively under CSC settings because airports are not included in any of these three communities. Yeah, but if your question is San Bernardino, so aircraft itself is not in the San Bernardino the inventory itself. However, the goods movement associated with it is included in the heavy duty trucks inventory.
Okay, and in regard to the personal product study, I'm sorry, I didn't read it. I'm just wondering, when they're doing these studies, do they take into account that these products are emitted indoors and then there's an air exchange rate going on? The products are depositing or being re-emitted within the indoor environment. How do they take that into account?
Right. I imagine it's being taken account at sort of a top-down approach. So we're looking at the chemical compounds that are used in manufacturing and then distributed. So when we get into indoor exposure, that's a whole other, almost a modeling exercise. And that's something that I imagine there are studies happening, but it's not something that the inventory traditionally would be accounting for.
So personal products, this is manufacturing only?
Well, consumer products would be anything that's more of like a personal care, like hairspray, deodorants, anything that would be purchased by someone, not necessarily used in an industrial or commercial setting. And it's really one of these cases where, in an individual product, maybe the emissions are low, but when you have an area with a lot of population, like say LA County, it adds up in the aggregate. So it's a major category in the sense of evaporative emissions from solvents.
Also, I'd like to follow up just very briefly. Thank you, Steve. Looks like I'm interfering in your answering, but some of this actually it is the indoor and outdoor, the exchange is not really included because this is emissions inventory. Again, we are not talking about concentration, but then strictly speaking, those needs to be considered when you're calculating ambient concentration. However, it is not only consumer product. For example, we do also have residential cookings or residential space heating. Strictly speaking, as you said, those emissions happening indoor settings, but then since we are putting as emissions inventory, we do not really care whether it's occurring inside the facility or outside. However, yeah, it's something to consider when you're coming to ambient concentration.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions, comments, one from Uduak and then Raphael, and then we're going to move on to monitoring.
Just a quick one, dovetailing on Marissa's question on slide 17 with the reefers. I know it's an international, a piece of equipment that's traveling. Is the it shows 90% reduction almost. Is that purely a membrane, or is there a new technology that's going to swap out for each container as it's coming in the ports? How does that get achieved?
I suspect it's a combination of improved technology, of diesel particulate filters. I could direct the question to someone in our off-road inventory, or maybe we can touch base with him afterwards. But I think it's a combination of all of the advanced technology might be coming in addition to possibly even idling rules in terms of shutoffs. But what is the major contributor? I'll have to defer to Corey.
Okay, thank you. So I have three brief, one a little more in depth. On the commercial cooking, just curious about your source. So the California Restaurant Association, how many members do they have that they would have this information from? And is it a good representative sample, or is it just a snapshot of their members, because I know some associations, while they may be large for their industry, may not have a good snapshot of the number of restaurants within their membership, and so we will get skewed data.
Right, that's an excellent point, and it's something that we deal with a lot of inventory categories where how do we find the best available data? And it's something like restaurants where you might have some smaller restaurants and maybe they're not as much on the radar. So we're always looking for the best available data to get a population of this equipment. Yeah, if we can get that, then we would be able to have.
Sure. So that's it's just we need to have a focus on what those graphs and data points just really represent. The other thing is on the off-road emissions, the other diesel equipment, has red fuel been changed to the low sulfur standard? We just, because I know there's growing trends and stuff and regulation in terms of switching on-road equipment over to the low diesel, low sulfur type of fuel. Has the red fuel caught up with that regulation as well? Or are they still using the higher sulfur content in those? Because we have a plethora of off-road red fuel type of equipment operating in our area. And so we want to make sure that
Yeah, that's another good question. I'll take that back to our off-road inventory folks.
Yeah, so, and so my next point, moving on this off-road, on ocean-going vessels, has CARB, because I know there's been talk amongst various nations and whatnot internationally, and so because many of these ocean-going vessel companies are actually registered in foreign countries, what discussions have been had in order to tighten up some of the regulations? Because I know diesel-going engines use the dirtiest fuels that are out there. So there's no way in heck we could really hope that they would start using this low sulfur fuel, given that they're just getting the bottom of the refined fuels. So what discussions are being had internationally speaking, given the sea level rise and the global warming concerns that many of third world nations and other large industrial nations are in discussion? Because we see this growing trend in China, where now they're really aggressive because of the Paris Accord and those nations that are still involved in that. And I know California has been separating themselves from the U.S. in some of those negotiations as well. And then I have one more other point on this emission projection. If somebody else wants to, I guess, address that particular concern. But the emission projection slide that you have, I just want to confirm that is the best case scenario. The emission projection in the South Coast Basin, that's the best case scenario, and that's just based off of current regulations and what emissions are supposed to be in there. I'm hoping that from this community action plan that we'll be able to get true data that's being emitted in the area and get better trending lines from it.
I'll answer real quickly on the red dye. So California was actually one of the leaders in the world, and around 2012 we required that ships coming into port switch over their fuel to a really low sulfur. Then in 2015 or so, the U.S. territorial waters followed, and then the IMO is following that in 2020. So in California waters and South Coast and near the ports, the ships should be on really low sulfur fuel. We do have an enforcement section that checks in regularly and tests the tanks to make sure that they're following that. There's a few exceptions where people have been fined, but in general, they are doing a good job following that. For the off-road equipment, They are also following low sulfur fuel, the same as on-road. There's slight difference in aromatics, but otherwise it's basically the exact same fuel sulfur content at this point. And then just last question on projections. So these are projections with best case scenario with existing rules. One of the things that CARB is working on right now is we are in progress on a number of rules. So ocean going vessels, we're amending the shore power regulation. We're looking at electrification of commercial harbor craft and cargo handling equipment, and we're doing some other things as well. So right now we're working where we think we have a good idea of where we're going. We're going to provide to South Coast, and for this group, the potential reductions that we're seeing off that. Doesn't mean that they're passed yet, but we'll give an update on this is where we think we're going with measures at this time.
So our hope is, and this is leading into the next segment, that your peaks system in some of the measurements and stuff that we'll be taking will help establish some, empirical data so that, CARB can really understand what's going on out there and then amend your data.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're going to go ahead and move on to the monitoring presentation. I apologize that it did not do a great job keeping us on time, so we're going to be quick. And I'm thinking since we took discussion and comments within each item, we can probably nix that agenda item 5. So go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to try and go through these slides a little bit quickly, especially some of the slides have been discussed extensively throughout our CSC meetings. And before I start, I want to also mention that right outside of the door, we have a show and tell type of, we have some of the monitors and sensors laid out there that you can see, and some of the staff are there to give you some more information. We also have one of our mobile platforms and a trailer that's going to be deployed and used for the community monitoring for 617 outside, and we're going to guide you there, and if you want to take a look and get some more information, we can do that right after this session ends. So I think you're all familiar with this timeline, so I'm not going to spend too much time. The purpose of this is just to show what type of information gathering we did throughout the CSC meetings in the past few months to get information on and select the boundary for each of the communities, gather input on different air quality concerns, how to categorize them and prioritize the monitoring. All the monitoring plans and the appendix documents were released throughout the past month, well, this current month actually, throughout May, and we're currently through the public comment period, which is going to end on 31st of May in 2 days. However, we continue to gather input and information and respond to all the comments as they come. So this is just to remind you about the elements, the major elements in the camp or the community air monitoring plans and the appendix documents. I want to also mention that there's going to be a third document coming out by July 1st. That would be the Quality Assurance Project Plan that will give more information on the typical operating protocols for each of the monitoring that we do, including our mobile platforms. This is just to remind everyone that this camp and all the monitoring plan and the efforts are going to be an ongoing process, because the monitoring has to be adjusted based on the input that we get from the steering committee members and the members of the public, and we have to make some adjustment based on the results and findings of the community air monitoring. And also, one of the main goals of community monitoring in general in the 617 is to support the emission reduction plans as well as the enforcement actions. So we will adjust and in order to support those programs. This is just the general proposed monitoring approach that was laid out in the camp. In general, We're going to begin with the mobile monitoring to pinpoint different sources and identify hotspots, and then that would inform our subsequent efforts and activities that could involve fixed monitoring and sensors. I'm not going through all of these details right now, but each of these monitoring methods have their own advantages and disadvantages, and there's no one perfect monitoring tool to address these air quality concerns. We have the big arsenal of all types of different monitoring technologies and methods, and a combination of these monitoring techniques would be the best way to approach these community monitoring efforts under 617. This is some of the detail of some of our mobile platforms that are going to be used in all three communities. One of them is our FluxSense van. It uses optical remote sensing technology and is a very powerful tool for measuring some of the air toxics, gaseous air toxics, and can conduct surveys and do concentration mapping in these communities. We also have developed our own South Coast AQMD mobile platform. This mobile platform has different monitors, very fast response monitors, so it can take measurements while driving around and driving through the communities. In fact, this mobile platform will be showcased outside, so if you want to check it out, I encourage you to stick around after this meeting. Another one is our trailers. The trailers do not take measurements while moving, so they have to be stationed in a certain place. So it's a little bit more difficult to find appropriate siting for them, but one of the good benefits is that it provides enough space so we can use different types of monitors in these trailers and potentially get a most comprehensive list of pollutants for measurements. And we're also developing another mobile platform that is mostly focused on measurement of VOCs. This will be equipped with a highly sensitive PTRMS that can measure hundreds of VOC compounds simultaneously at 1 second time resolution and in very, very low concentrations in parts per billion and trillion concentration levels. So all those mobile platforms will be operated by the AQMD staff, but we also have some contractors that are working with us for these monitoring activities. One of them is the Aerospace Research for Aerial Measurements and Surveys, and we're also working with AQMD to do some type of measurements that is more focused on looking at the diesel particulate and the impact of the truck traffic and idling in the communities. And lastly, the Aerodyne Research mobile platform also is equipped with a very highly sensitive PTRMS to measure VOCs, and in future, they might also help us with some mobile measurements for toxic metals. So I want to give some examples of some of the monitoring efforts that have already begun or going to begin by July 1st. So one of these would be the aerial measurements and surveys that we're doing with Aerospace Corporation. They're already scheduled to take multiple surveys on July 10th and 11th. And this will include all the three communities. In fact, it includes most of our air basin, but the data interpretation and the data analysis that they will be doing is mostly focused on these three communities. I also want to mention that other than these surveys that they're scheduled to do in July, they've been doing some other surveys in the past in our basin, and we have access to those data, and we're working with them to interpret and analyze those data, and that information is very helpful to guide us in our ground-based monitoring, including mobile platforms or fixed monitoring, and identification of some unknown sources and different hotspots. So the main purposes of this monitoring is to detect plumes and emissions and identify hotspots and unknown sources. as well as to focus our ground-based efforts. Yes.
Just on that, what is the output? Like, is it looking for concentrations, or is it like emissions rates? Like, what's the data you get from it?
So they're looking mostly at emission rates, I mean, the amount of data that they gather is like humongous. So like what they have to do is they focus their study area to a specific area that in this case it will be the 617 community boundaries. And then they look for hotspots of highest emissions of different compounds, including air toxics. So that would pinpoint some certain sources of emission, potential sources of emissions. And then in order to get the ambient, their contribution to the ambient levels, we have to do ground-based monitoring. This is some of the monitoring activity that is going to begin very soon. Some of it actually has already begun. It is our own mobile platform and also the mobile platform operated by AQMD. They will be mostly focused on criteria pollutants and the precursors for diesel exhaust. So these mobile platforms can drive all around the communities to look at the hotspots and assess the impact of idling truck emissions on the community exposure. They can also look at the near road measurements, for example, looking at the freeway emissions and busy intersections and roadways and transportation corridors. So our mobile platform, again, is going to be outside. So if you want to check it out, please stick around after this meeting. And just wanted to mention that these mobile platforms will be deployed in all 3 communities. Another monitoring that will begin on July 1st and goes through July 20th is our Fluxense van that's going to do some concentration mapping in Wilmington, Carson, and West Long Beach community. This is an ideal tool to look at the impacts of large emission sources like refineries or large area sources like tank farms. They're very powerful tools to detect leaks and that could inform any type of subsequent actions. In this community, we're also doing some fixed monitoring that is mostly focused on diesel, PM precursors, and air toxics. One of the monitoring activities that's going to begin early July in San Bernardino community is placing some fixed monitoring at the Alessandro Elementary School. There were some concerns from the CSC members in the meetings that we had in San Bernardino about odors that are coming from the Omnitrans facility. And Omnitrans representatives mentioned that some of the natural gas refueling that happens in this facility is mostly scheduled overnight. One of the limitations, I want to say, of mobile platform is you're only capturing a snapshot of the moment that you're taking the measurement. It's not the best tool to look at, for example, the diurnal variations. And most of our activities are scheduled during the day, although if necessary, those could be also scheduled overnight. But what I want to say that in this case, we're going straight to fixed monitoring, although some mobile monitoring will also support these efforts. So the monitoring here will be using a Picaro. It measures methane and H2S. Both of them are associated with either odors or natural gas emissions. And this could be even augmented with some sensors for criteria pollutants. Lastly, for East LA community and Boyle Heights and West Commerce, we're going to have our partners, Aerodyne Research, to have mobile measurements in these communities, mostly focused on odors. So as I mentioned earlier, this mobile platform is equipped with a very sensitive equipment for measuring hundreds of VOCs simultaneously and in very, very low concentration levels. So it might be the best available tool for taking some measurements of the odors, because as you may know, some of even the most sophisticated technologies are not as good when it comes as good as a human nose when it comes to detecting some of the odors. But this is a very powerful tool that could guide us in measuring air toxics and PM and VOCs and identifying hotspots and pinpointing those emission sources. And looking at the community impact assessment. This is also could be deployed in support of the SERP and as well as the enforcement actions. So with that, I want to open this up for discussion and questions. And sorry if I moved quickly on any of these. We will be here even after this meeting if you have any questions. Should I start with this? Rafael?
Thank you. So I wanted to stick around because I do have to go. But so I want to emphasize, one of the most important things here in this particular community monitoring plan. I know in our community and stuff, because we have a high number of mobile source emissions and whatnot, the emphasis needs to be in a mobile source emission reduction in our plan. And that's going to be the highest priority for us. And the odors and all that other stuff. And then, as we discussed in previous meetings and whatnot, we just need to make sure that the freeways, local roadways and all that other stuff, truck traffic and automobile traffic and stuff is addressed. And instrumental in that will be the use of the peak system. So I noticed that it's not listed in this particular new monitoring technologies we use. I mean, that is going to be the thing that we're, I'm hoping that we're going to be focusing on. So, and I know CARB has developed that, and in their previous slide presentation, they were mentioning that an unmanned system that they're currently developing is just about ready for rollout, and I'm hoping to have it utilized here in this particular plan. So, I'm hoping, hopefully within the next 6 months, we could see a number of units deployed within our communities and stuff. And I know we can easily identify that many, at least a half dozen locations where this monitoring really needs to take place. So I know that there's perhaps some reluctancy in for whatever reason in utilizing this technology, but that needs to be quickly overcome, and it literally needs to be the mainstay of this study. So yeah, thank you.
So one thing I just wanted to add, and this specific slide, is that some of our mobile monitoring that is geared to diesel PM and diesel PM precursor measurements will be in support of CARB's effort using those peak systems, and we can support those measurements by doing a more comprehensive measurement exactly where they deploy these peak systems.
And then I'll just mention also, we'll have actually local government buy-in and stuff. And I know that staff is actually working on reaching some sort of agreements with Caltrans and whatnot in order to help out with the study as well. So we'll have many availabilities of the public roadways, monitoring locations, and all that other stuff available. And our hope is, we could have CARB also do checkpoints and whatnot for equipment, compliance, and code enforcement. Thank you.
And also, a couple of other things, but just also to bring the other members of the TAG up to speed to some of the conversation we had before. Definitely what we are proposing here is just, a way to start by the deadline, which is July 1st. And, for different technologies, there are different timelines. Definitely, we have access to the mobile platforms right away, and so it will be easier to implement that, and it's also part of the strategy of the camp. In terms of the peaks and the other technology developed by CARB, the implementation will take a little longer, and I think that maybe 6 months seems fair in terms of understanding how it works. Making sure that we discuss with CARB the best way to implement it in all of the 3 communities. But again, different technology will take different times to implement correctly. But we are working on all fronts.
Yeah, just it needs to be included in the plan. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely.
So what's the gap in time between when you do the mobile monitoring and when you'll have the data ready to share back?
I think it widely varies. So like if during that survey, for example, a hypothetical example, if they detect very, very high levels of some certain pollutants, especially if it's air toxics, without even like really sitting down and analyzing the data, we can inform, for example, our compliance and enforcement team and work with other divisions. But in the normal situation, again, depending on what types of pollutants, the number of pollutants, it could sometimes take up to a month, I would say. So weeks.
Hey, I have a couple of comments, but I'd like to see in the camp, I'm going to submit a written comment on this too, is the community air monitoring plan to have the community involved a little bit more, not in the technical monitors that are proposed there, but maybe with the, say, the AQMD mobile platform or some of the low-cost sensors. And by saying the community, just probably a few representatives that are working with the AQMD in placing and reviewing some of the data coming out of the low-cost sensors. And I think that it's important to have this because I've spoken with several members of our San Bernardino CSC about this, and to have the inclusion of some community members into the data collection process. Again, not some of the more complicated instruments, but maybe some of the more low-cost instruments like the AQ spec grade low-cost instrumentation, I think is important. And if we can make that a little more clear in the camp, I'll be submitting a written comment about this. But if we can have that a little bit more specified in the camp, that would be great.
Thank you, Ryan. And one thing I want to add to this is that you're right, the current camp doesn't provide too much of information on our sensor deployment. Sensors and our sensor network is actually our most powerful tool to engage the communities, and it's going to be used as one of the educational tools and to engage the CSC members and the members of the public. One reason that there's not so much information at this point is we're going to rely on these mobile measurements that we're doing to identify hotspots, looking at the potential places for the placement of the sensors, and we're really going to rely on actually the members of community members in order to find good places for these sensors. So we will be working with the community with that. Some of that effort has begun in our Wilmington community. So we already have placed like a network of about 20 sensors, but it's at the initial stages right now. But we will definitely be doing that in San Bernardino and East LA community as well.
And is there a vendor?
I was going to add to that.
Okay,
so,
go ahead.
As you may or may not be aware, we're looking at getting a second chamber along with extra sensors to supplement a program, essentially a sensor library program. So just to your point, where we're giving priority to the AB617 communities for people who would like to be part of that kind of educational, but also provide information regarding regarding pollutants that would be appropriate for that community. So that program's in development, but we're getting the infrastructure developed for that. And it's not going to be prime time for the July 1st start time, but it is something as we develop into the future and kind of how we incorporate the learnings that we have from our EPA STAR grant, where we've been doing work with community members and developing a community toolbox as we learn more about kind of the data that goes along with it and communication of that data. So as we learn more about that, we'll have a more fleshed out program, but we're not ready for prime time, but we are getting the infrastructure ready for exactly what you're looking for.
Great. Just one more question was, how is the data that's being collected for all of these sensors? Is there any kind of external validation for the data collection as well, or is it all managed and the methodology is all reviewed within house? I see that there's 3 vendors as well, but just a quick question on that.
So in terms of, a kind of broader answer about how we'll handle the data, so there are 2, separate paths. The master plan, so to speak, is to develop a data platform specifically to handle not just the sensor data, but all of the data that are going to come from, fixed monitoring and, all of the monitoring instrumentation that will be deployed for this program, but also for other programs, including Rule 1180. So that's what we are trying to develop right now. It will take, the platform won't be ready by July 1st, but hopefully, sometimes in 2020, hopefully early. That platform will have, data validation procedures to automatically, at least eliminate all of the data that are negative or are above a certain threshold. But then, there's different level of validation, as you know, and then, it might take, up, I think, to a month or maybe more in order to complete the full validation of every data that we collect within AB617 and other programs. What we will do right away, starting July 1st, again, there are validation procedure in place at least to guarantee that all of the data that go online, all of the near real-time and real-time information that go on the website right away, they're going to be validated at least to exclude all of the data that do not make sense. But, the long-term plan is to have something that is, a lot more robust and, specifically dedicated to the program.
One question by email, so I want to respond to that as well. Question is from Julia May. She's asking that in the past, a lot of the equipment for detection of, for example, H2S and some of the other odors cannot detect these compounds at the same level that the human nose can. And she's asking, could you address your monitoring resources and any improvements in detecting these hazardous sulfur compounds that are common emissions from oil refinery and oil extraction? So we're looking at the best available technologies, and they're definitely going to be involved in the 617. But I also want to mention, since this question is directed at the oil refineries and oil extraction, I want to also say that our Rule 1180, the refinery fence line and community air monitoring, will also taking measurements for H2S at the fence line of the refineries as well as within the community, which includes multiple 2 or 3 community monitoring stations in the Wilmington community as well.
Hey, so I do understand that we are going to be losing this room pretty soon. So with that, we have the 1 p.m. Oh, well, I. Okay, all right. So in any case, I think I need to, I want to make one quick announcement. So I understand we had said quarterly meetings where we're going to compress the time frame a little bit because we got deadlines to hit. And so we're trying to schedule the next TAG meeting for about mid-July. I do want to note that our plan, as we had indicated, was to submit a package and go to our stationary source committee, and I believe that is July 26th, if I remember correctly. But I do want to reassure you that we will still be, obviously taking comments from the advisory group as well as the public on the source attribution until about early August, and we will try to, those comments wouldn't be reflected, obviously, if we're going to committee on the 26th of July, but we would try to integrate those comments and suggestions before the board package has to go in about late August. So I just wanted to kind of give you guys a heads up. And so, of course, kind of the main topic for a mid-July meeting would be the source attribution public draft report, which we will try to work on and release by then. And that will, of course, include community level inventories by the various source categories that we were beginning to discuss today. So any other requests for a mid-July meeting? Nope. Okay. You can also email me or Sang-mi as well. And then I'm going to open it up to public comment. Any public comment? Just one? Harvey? Okay, go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name's Harvey Eder. I'm speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition and all 90% of the folks that want to see equitable and just solar transition as quickly as possible. I don't know why this technical committee did not go into things like BARCed solutions, technology. That should be part of this, and it's totally omitted. For instance, solar's come down 80–90% in cost in the last 10 years, and is BARCed and needs to be put into the clearinghouse and whatnot. Which also, there's a meeting tonight on Colton. That's in San Bernardino County, and 2 weeks ago we were at the community college there. I'm going to that one, but I don't understand why there's two separate groups. I could talk later. Also, instead of using the 2023 and 2031 as the dates in the 16 district plan, you use 24 and 19. I'm not sure why. Also, for your base year, and I have heard LA Times say that there have been very high increases on days that failed to meet standards, like going up 100, 200% or something like that. It's not omitted. So what you're using 17, you should have the numbers from 18, but you should go back to the plan in 16 use a 15 base year. And the only thing that shows not meeting your standards is San Bernardino. I don't think that's real. If we look at the information given in the Times, that there's problems here. There's actually increases, I believe, instead of decreases. Just want to make sure that we get this input into the draft on the plans through the 31st, which is Friday. Intend to do that. Don't have time to put everything in now, but maybe you could respond to a couple of these points. I have some others, but can you respond to these?
Sure. So we're trying to focus on the portions, the technical portions of the plan of the plans in this committee. So basically, technical portions of the CAMP or the SERP. BARCed, of course, is part of the kind of overarching AB 617 program, but it's not explicitly part of those plans. It's something that obviously will affect those communities, but it will actually affect all facilities across our 4-county jurisdiction. So that's why we're not talking about it in this context, but we are holding public working groups for the reclaim transition. So certainly anyone who wishes to can participate in those. The Colton meeting that is happening tonight, that is for the year 2 community selection. So remember, ARB is required to consider communities for an AB 617 designation. The 3 communities that we were discussing today were the ones designated in year 1, and then we're going through the process in terms of figuring out which communities may be designated in year 2. So that is not a steering committee meeting tonight. That is a year 2 community selection outreach meeting that's happening in Colton. And then regarding the comment about the news article in the LA Times about the days that fail to meet the standard, I believe you're talking about the ozone standard. So that's something that obviously we are keeping very close track of and continuing to do a lot of work on that front through the implementation of the Air Quality Management Plan, or AQMP. So that work is ongoing, and I would say that if you look at the data, and we've presented this publicly in committee meetings and whatnot, if you look at the data, actually the ozone levels really are going down, even if the number of days that fail to meet the standard can vary from year to year. That's not a very sensitive metric, but if you look at the ppm, that's a more relevant metric to be looking at in terms of tracking progress over time.
One other question. Dave Pettit from NRDC. Anyway, he made a statement that there's a certain standard of what can be used in litigation. And I'd like to know which technology is being placed where it can hold up in court. That's very important to those of us that consider all options.
I'm sorry, the question was which technologies can be used where?
To collect emissions information, to have valid information that will hold up in court, according to David Pettit, and he's like point person in California for NRDC. He's an attorney, right? He said, certain testing facilities and practices can be used and others can't. I'd like to know what those are. What will hold up in court?
I think none of us are attorneys here, but maybe Jason can talk about the kind of source testing side of it.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to get into, is that there are approved source testing methods, which are methods that a team would go on site to the facility looking at a specific piece of equipment for a specific process and operation, and they would go in with an accepted source technique, and that varies depending on what the pollutant is and depends on what the process and operation is, but a lot of that's available online. Be happy to send you some of that information if you give me your address.
All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and close the meeting, so thank you so much.
I can turn this on. So as a reminder, we are gonna take a tour of the two mobile trailers downstairs. So if you wanna stick around, there is outside in that hallways, there is a table with some of the monitoring equipment. We can all meet there and then, figure out what to do next. Thank you.